So our emotional issues make perfect, coherent, even rational sense, given our real experience with the world around us. So this issue is very close to me because I often hear people talking as if they are broken or weak or just being difficult or crazy. And that upsets me because I truly believe that our brain is doing what it's doing for good reasons. Now, there's some scientific explanation for that, which we'll go into, but also that just makes logical sense. Like, why would our brain be trying to mess with us? So even our behaviors that we think of as more irrational or self-defeating, on some level, our brain really does believe that those choices will end up best for us or for our group through some experience, something it learned in the past. So what we think of as our patterns, at some point they were necessary adaptations for us, or at least are built on assumptions about how the world works that, while they might seem irrational, are actually from real experiences with the world. So in the last video, we talked about what our emotional reactions are based on. So I'll just say the same thing again, just try to say it in a slightly different way this time. So think of it like this. If every experience you have with life, especially as you're a child, which is when you're learning how to be alive, all the experiences are like data points coming at you. Now your brain is constantly having to make sense of those data points by finding some pattern. I think of it like when you see a sheet with data and you have to do statistical analysis to actually draw the pattern, to figure out the pattern from what otherwise could look like chaos. That's actually what the brain does through a process called statistical learning. Actually, the brain is constantly doing unconscious statistical analyses to see what is associated with what is probabilistically likely to happen together. The reason it does that is so that it can make predictions based on an input about what's about to happen, and also predictions about how do I need to respond. So those predictions, those doing this unconscious sort of statistical comparing about in terms of what's happening now and comparing it to what we experienced in the past and the patterns that we develop to understand the world and how to respond to it, that's going on all the time and is the base of our emotional reactions and honestly most of our behavior. So if a certain smell is associated with Dad being drunk, then in the future our brain will remember that, such that when we smell that smell, we will predict perhaps danger. Because statistically speaking, that smell was associated with danger. Now, rationally, we may know that that smell does not mean that Dad's in the room or present. But that's not how the brain works. The brain just knows, statistically speaking, that smell is associated with danger. And also, statistically speaking, this response, like running to my room to get away, is associated with more protection for myself. So that's constantly going on, running in the background in what we would call the unconscious. So it's unconsciously always preparing our body and perceiving reality through the lens of how what's happening now is likely to be understood. What's the likeliest explanation based on my previous experiences? But to continue with this metaphor, if now as an adult you are struggling, it is not because your brain has done a bad job taking its experiences and all those data points and finding the patterns and making meaning. It is simply that those experiences you've had, those data points, are a skewed sample. That's it. In other words, the world you started out in, which is most powerfully your family of origin, when your brain is learning these patterns and figuring out what to expect and how to respond from life, that world differs in important ways from the world at large. Or perhaps that original world, those original data points simply differ from your life now, as a single adult, or the family that you've created, or simply the reality and the family you want to create. Because the truth is, the world you learned and adapted to is not the world or reality you're trying to create from yourself, most likely. So that's a big problem for the brain. When the ways that you were conditioned, basically to survive your family of origin, those set of imperatives may vastly differ from the set of imperatives of building a beautiful life. And that's really important to understand because sometimes we're so frustrated by our own, what we think of as our own resistance or irrationality, or why can't we just do what we know or rationally know would be a good idea? But underneath that are deeper, again, imperatives that at one time were really, truly what you needed to do to survive the world. So you may be wondering, if my brain is so great at adapting, why doesn't it just continue to adapt? Continue to learn and make new assumptions and make new behavioral patterns that actually fit what's in front of me now? Well, here's the rub a little bit. Our brain, if left to its own devices, doesn't necessarily that actively update its view of reality. If that view is already so learned, it's like it just knows that to be true. Once the brain feels like it knows something, either through a million, repetitions of experience or one big powerful experience, which we would call a trauma, it doesn't necessarily just always stay open for continued input. And actually, it would be very cumbersome to live in a world where we were always that open to learning. Like if we walked out in like this childlike state of open-mindedness and naivety of what we're going to find and how we might try to respond, the world would just eat us alive. I mean, it would be overwhelming, the sensory input and how to make sense of it if we can't rest on some basic assumptions. So there's good reason that our brain doesn't always just shift with every new moment and try to learn life anew every day. It does help us move through the world. Plus, if you think about it, for most of our evolution, the world we were born into was pretty much the one we were going to stay in. It wasn't like today where maybe you have an abusive family, but then you go off and make another healthier family, or you move from one side of the world to the other side of the world. Evolutionarily, we would have just had our little tribe of 30 people, and pretty much whatever we learned during childhood was going to be adaptive during adulthood. So this personal growth mission, it's a little bit of a new thing for the brain. It's a little bit tricky for the brain to change deeply in that way. Doesn't mean it can't do it. There actually are very clear steps that unlock the brain to learn again, which of course we'll be talking about in a later video. And another important point I want to make, if you're thinking, okay, so I understand that my early learning may not be adaptive in my adult life, but it didn't seem adaptive even in my first context, in my childhood. How is it adaptive for me to check out at school or start using drugs when I was 12 or never assert myself with my dad or beat up my sister? So that's a really great question. And that brings us to a really important point. And that is, while some of these early adaptations don't seem good, or maybe they really are not that healthy, they were, from the perspective of the brain, statistically speaking, they really seem to be the lesser of two evils. So let's say your brain learned, it's a good idea, I need to rage anytime somebody criticizes me. So that response, raging, is going to have huge costs. And yet, if you as a child were in a family system so steeped in shame, and perhaps maybe you were particularly attacked and criticized, your system might have learned as a way to protect itself that I need to push that back and go to rage instead. Otherwise, an even greater evil, which is my whole sense of self being sort of crippled and my capacity to engage in this world sort of disabled through the shame, that would be a greater evil, so therefore I must rage instead. Or perhaps in the moments of shame, if the child freezes or kind of disengages and isn't showing up productively and the family shames them even more, punishes that child for not functioning well. So in order to function well, they have to not feel shame, so they'll feel rage instead. So just to draw this point home a little bit more, let's say that same child, when in the face of shame and he would kind of freeze, maybe he learned, if I freeze, if I let myself go to a non-functional state, I can't protect my younger brother from dad's rage. So I've got to keep myself pulled up and sort of strong and steeled up just for the sake of protecting my younger brother. So for me, the tragedy of this is partly the fact that it happens so unconsciously. So all the child will experience is, hey, I'm wanting to rage a lot more and more. And as they grow into an adult, it might be really easy for the explanation to be, I must just be an angry person. Or even worse, a bad person. Or a person that doesn't care about others. When the whole reason the rage as a behavior got set up is because he did care about his younger brother and was needing to protect him. Or maybe it was just to protect his own sanity or his own body, but that's also completely valid. So this is why earlier I said, to me, it's so upsetting when I hear people judge themselves without really exploring deeper to see what is truly driving that behavior. What experiences really taught my brain that it is imperative for me to do that thing or avoid doing this other thing. So in my work with clients, it's just never been the case that we were exploring underneath to see what's driving the behavior, and at the bottom we just came to, oh, the deal is you're just a terrible person. That's never the explanation. Of course it isn't. It's never the explanation that that person is just bad or weak or stupid. There's always a coherent, understandable set of imperatives and learnings that came in emotionally that really can help us both understand and then therefore not judge what we think of as our emotional issues. So in the next video, we will go over this again in a bit more detail, connecting it to attachment theory and giving more examples. But the message I'd like to give in this video is if you're suffering, it isn't because anything's wrong with you or even how your brain is working. Your brain has done its job. It's adapted. It's just that your early childhood experiences required you to adapt in ways that have some huge costs. Now, those costs, like the lack of capacity for joy or peace or closeness, those costs might have been worth it when you were younger, but there's a chance they're no longer worth it anymore. So allowing the brain to realize that and perhaps make some new adaptations as an adult is what healing is all about.